So hello, my name is Kai Johnson. I am currently a 4th and 5th grade teacher at an independent school in the Upper West Side, Metropolitan Montessori School, and I am also a master's student at Bank Street. I completed the field test last spring in 2013, and I just thought I would share some of my particular experiences, and I think, I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. I thank all the people on the committee who put it together. I think dealing with these sort of issues, whether it's implementation, where it's a larger macro issue that we heard some panelists talk about before, and just sort of a question of where does the teaching profession go from here? What sort of issues are you dealing with, both within the profession, but then the larger swirling issues of the politics and reform, as it were, from many different perspectives. I think it's a really necessary conversation. So my field test experience was a little bit different than, I think, some of the stories I'm hearing here, and I imagine Maeve will talk about in a minute. But when I was at Bank Street, I was the first person to complete it at my institution, so there really wasn't any road map in place. I sort of thought of it as like you're building a plane while flying it, and there's an element of that same thing that I'm hearing here, where it's a real challenge to take something that's being asked from the state to implement and do it at a very quick time frame. The result of that was I was navigating the handbook by myself, I was trying to figure out the technology by myself, the costs were definitely difficult. It took a lot of initiative on my part to figure out, okay, I need a tripod, I need to figure out all this stuff. And so I'm very heartened to hear that it sounds like a lot of the teacher preparation programs are doing a lot to address those, because that was definitely the hardest part for me. In terms of my own personal situation, it was a little bit different in that I was a head teacher at my school while I was doing this. So instead of just being in a placement and I have more limited time with the students, these were kids I knew really well. If the video recording didn't go well one week, I could plan another lesson segment and do it again the next week. Even within that, it was, as everyone is saying, the high stakes nature of it was very difficult. There's an enormity of the task of planning, the writing, the reflection, and then all the logistics that make this a challenging assessment. I do also think that there was real value in what I was asked to do, in this sense of maybe things that my teacher preparation program hadn't worked with me on yet, or that may be lacking. So for instance, I'm thinking particularly the use of videotape is something that was very helpful for me. I had to get over, as John sort of mentioned, the fear of seeing yourself, and I realized, oh my goodness, I'm going bald at 28, and it was very nerve-wracking. And I spend the first 10 minutes thinking about that, but once you get over that fear, and it's a terrifying one, there's value in looking at yourself, oh my goodness, my voice sounds like that. As a teacher, do I really talk that way to a student who's not paying attention? Maybe I need to temper my tone. There were all these very practical things that, frankly, I wasn't going to videotape myself, and my teacher preparation program hadn't asked me to do that. And in that way, it did make me a better teacher. And I, interestingly enough, even noted that it sort of spread in an odd sense to some of my other teachers. So videotaping was something we started considering more for faculty meetings. Maybe we do a 15-minute video analysis at the end of the week as part of our staff meeting. Things that really hadn't been a conversation came about because I was doing this process. Within that, I also think and I think Bev pointed out a lot of the nice features of it. There are a lot of elements of the philosophy that align with what I've learned at Bank Street, and in particular, the writing and reflection components. Although I agree some of the language in the handbook is very difficult to navigate, there might be a benefit for having a common language, but figuring out what an academic learning task and the literacy strategy that I was going to implement, that was difficult for me. But within that, there was opportunity for reflection. I could clarify what I did. I could provide a justification for why I wanted this lesson to be that way. I was tremendously benefited by the fact that I had a class of 16 kids. I knew them very well. I mean, in my particular circumstance, I was very fortunate. And I think a big question is in schools where that's not the case, or for teachers who don't have as much of an opportunity to be with the kids every day, that is the biggest issue, because, and we'll probably hear about this, but it is a very difficult task if you're asking someone to do all this in a particular context. I think, I voiced a number of the concerns, and I think we've heard a lot of them, but I sort of came up with some big questions, which is, how do you weigh what is happening in the larger movement of teacher education and the education movement generally, with trying to find a space for a teacher's voice, and I think that Falk put it nicely before, which is, okay, if this is an assessment by teachers rather than something coming from on high at a policy level or a politician who has no teaching experience. And I think it's a question, do we need to raise the bar for teachers and candidates? And then what supports are in place at the teacher education level to really make sure that happens? I think it would have been very beneficial for me to have a community of people to go through this with at Bank Street. I would have learned a lot more. I would have talked about academic learning. I would have heard about maybe a different strategy about something. I would have talked about a different way to teach fractions. All of these things aren't necessarily happening. I'm busy, I have a job, I'm in grad school, I go home and I do my work, I have grading, but it would have provided an opportunity for me to have conversations that I didn't really have. So I think there's some element of considering, at least for me, this made me a better teacher in many ways. Probably my biggest complaint was that once I got the score, and it is that, as John said, I got an Excel spreadsheet with 15 numbers. Now, for me, there's no value in feedback, or just quantitative feedback. I need someone to explain, okay, on lesson planning, you got a 2.5 on the rubric. Let's not even look at the rubric. I'm an experienced teacher, this is what you could have done better. I think to the extent that we can have a conversation about how that happens makes this entire process much more meaningful, and it makes me feel like my hundreds of hours of work, or however much work I put into it, actually results in some meaningful guidance in how I can make myself a better teacher. And so I'm very much looking forward to more of those conversations this afternoon.